Good morning. Welcome to the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. I'm Ed Steinfeld, the Institute Director. Let me first congratulate all of you. I know for many different reasons we have in the room, I'm sure, alums who are here for reunions. Congratulations. We have graduating students. Congratulations. We have parents, grandparents, and even for those of us who aren't directly tied to a reunion participant or a degree recipient, I think it's just a great weekend of celebration. It's a pleasure for me and a privilege to be part of it. Let me just say a word about the event this morning. Through the course of the year, at Brown and at Watson in particular, we have a number of invited speakers and prominent speakers, big audiences, and that's a normal part of life here. It's a normal part of life at our peer institutions. But for me, as much as I like the big invited outside guests, that's not the most exciting part of life here in the Brown community. What's most exciting to me and what's most distinctive are the everyday conversations that happen between brilliant minds, whether they happen to be on the staff or students or faculty or graduate students, postdocs, regardless of hierarchy, regardless of where people are in their careers, what stage of their careers. The willingness of individuals in this community to communicate with one another, to learn from one another, and then to reach out and help the rest of us learn, I think that's really unparalleled. It's the most exciting thing that happens here, and it is really distinctive. And it was my hope today to give you all a flavor of that kind of communication. So what we've done today is to invite, in my view, two of the truly most brilliant minds in the community to talk about an issue that's of great concern to all of us, great concern to all of us in the United States, but in a number of other countries as well, and that's the phenomenon of mass incarceration. And the question of how do we get here and where do we go from here? Let me briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll move forward. To your far right is economist Glenn Loury. Glenn is the Merton Stoltz Professor of the Social Sciences here at Brown. As I'm sure you all know, Professor Loury has published in many different areas of the economics discipline, microeconomic theory, game theory, industrial organization, natural resources economics, and the economics of race and inequality. Glenn is the recipient and winner of numerous prizes. He's received the Guggenheim Fellowship, the Carnegie Scholarship. He is given the prestigious Tanner Lectures on Human Values at Stanford, the James Moffett Lectures in Ethics at Princeton, the Du Bois Lectures in African American Studies at Harvard. And again, as I'm sure you know, Glenn, in addition to being an esteemed scholar, is a public intellectual and social critic, particularly on themes of racial inequality and social policy. Sociologist Adaner Usmani is at an earlier stage in his career. Adaner is a postdoctoral fellow here at Watson. We have a 2-year postdoctoral program where, again, we get these unbelievably talented people from all over the world, from the best institutions of higher learning. We have the privilege of hosting them for 2 years, and then they go out and continue their careers, often in other places and occasionally even here at Brown. Adaner received his PhD from NYU and his BA from Harvard. His research interests really span 2 areas. He works on the rise and fall of labor movements over the course of the 20th century and into the 21st century, and considers the effects of the rise and fall of labor on politics and political change. But his second strand of work has to do with the American phenomenon of mass incarceration, with a particular focus on racial politics and its origins and reproduction. What I've asked Adaner and Glenn to do is really just have a conversation. Adaner, in some sense, is going to interview Glenn, but it's going to be a multi-directional interview and exchange of views. They're going to do that for half an hour, 40 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions and participation. So let me turn it over to you, Adaner and Glenn. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ed. Thanks very much for the invitation, and thanks, Glenn, for agreeing to do it. I have to say before we start that Glenn has been a major force in my intellectual development, and that's partly because of his books and his articles, but especially because of his podcast, The Glenn Show, which all of you, if you haven't looked at, should watch. So I thought what we'd do is two things in this conversation. The title of the event, as Ed noted, is something like, how did we get here and where do we go from here? So there's both sort of an analytical challenge to us, which is to explain how we got here, and then there's a normative challenge to say something about where we ought to go from here. What's wrong with American mass incarceration and where should we go policy-wise? So I'd like to do both of those things. I think we'll start maybe the first 30 minutes or so we'll spend talking about the analytical challenge, and then we'll talk about the normative challenge. In the analytical challenge specifically, I think there are actually three big questions. One big question is this sort of longitudinal question, an over time question. Something changed in the United States in about the 1970s. For most of modern American history, the incarceration rate was around 100, 150 per 100,000. In the 1970s, that changed, and by the early 2000s, it had gone up 5 or 6-fold. So the first question for us is to understand and to explain what changed in America. There's a second question, too, which is a cross-sectional question, which is the question of why certain groups, especially African Americans, are so much more likely to be imprisoned in the United States than other racial groups. So that's the second analytical question. And then the final analytical question is what explains the American exception? America is unique not just amongst developed countries, but also unique in the world, really, in the level of incarceration. It's more than every European country, but also, and maybe this is not as well known, higher than China, higher than Cuba, higher than Russia. So that's also something I think we should try and explain. But let's start, I think, with the longitudinal question, which is, I think, the most natural way into this question. Glenn, if you had to explain what changed in America in the 1970s, how would you attack that question? What do you think happened?
Okay, so, there doesn't have to be an answer to this question. I
That's
mean, I
not
think
fair.
this is a kind of epistemological point, but it's a point worth making. Not all questions have answers. And a big question like what accounts for some massive historical transformation of institutions and social practice, it's going to likely be many, many things. And this is the kind of thing a historian would take up in some narrative account to try to give a thick description of all the things that are going on. I think of a few things. Increasing crime and concerns about the effects of increasing crime would have to be mentioned. If you look at the trends in, offending, violent crime and so forth, they do trend upward in the 1960s in ways that would have demanded some kind of political response. There is the fact of the civil rights movement and racial upheaval and a challenge to institutions, and some scholars have speculated that what we see in this early 70s and afterwards in terms of sharply increasing incarceration rates is at least partly a response, a kind of indirect response to opposition to the changes in other areas of American life associated with the civil rights protest and the assertiveness of African American populations. I think about David Garland's argument in The Culture of Control about changing ideas about punishment. I think about, sorry, I'm blanking on his name right now. He's the late legal scholar at Harvard. The Collapse of American Criminal Justice is the book. I'll think of his name.
Stunts.
Yeah,
Is that right?
Yeah, it's Stunts. Stunts. A concern about agency problems. So, local authorities are making decisions about law enforcement and whatnot. States are bearing the cost of punishment. There's a kind of disjunction between decision makers and cost and so on. I think about the role of prosecutors and such. I think about the war on drugs. So sorry if that's not an entirely
No, that's fine. So no, it's so many different things moved in America in the 1970s-ish.
I mean, I think one of the things we need to address directly is the rise of incarceration in America a expression of racial antipathy?
Sure.
Is it ultimately, at the end of the day, an anti-black kind of thing? The celebrated writer Ta-Nehisi Coates has an essay on the Moynihan Report, which I'm sure you're familiar with, in which he says, this is Daniel Patrick Moynihan, this is the mid-1960s, this is this famous, infamous internal document that ended up becoming a public document in which he was assessing the state of play in terms of domestic policy around race issues and lamenting the rise of single-parent families amongst African Americans and calling for increased federal employment for African American men as a way to counter this trend, which he felt would impede the full attainment of equality for African Americans. And this contemporary writer, Coates, looks back on this report and he looks at the rise of mass incarceration and he kind of links the two. Well, we didn't do what Moynihan said we ought to do, which was enhance economic opportunities for the lower class of American society, including African American society. We didn't do that. Instead, we responded with mass incarceration. So there's a kind of, argument there about the poverty of American social policy being an expression of American racism. I don't subscribe to that argument. I think it's oversimplified. I think it overlooks the fact that there was substantial support for increased law enforcement, including tougher penalties for offenders coming from within the African American community. And this has been noted by a number of writers recently. James Forman at Yale, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Locking Up Our Own.
Brown alum?
A Brown alum, it should be noted, indeed. We do good work here. There was another book out there, again, I'm blocking on the name. About
Michael Fortner's.
Yeah,
book on
Fortner's.
Harlem.
About Harlem and the concerns about drug trafficking, the heroin epidemic there, the ancillary negative effects on communities of this kind of activity, and a long history of the under-policing of African American communities. Sure. Offenses against African Americans didn't register to the same degree with the authorities back in the Jim Crow era, and so black people were left to our own devices to deal with criminal offending within our communities, demanding that the police take offenses against us as seriously as others. So this sort of direct argument about racial antipathy leading to an institution of criminal punishment that then ends up confining large numbers, as it were, the new Jim Crow. Here we have yet again American racism rearing its ugly head, I think is an oversimplified account. On the other hand, and finally I'll say, and I know you're going to want to get more into this, incarceration is one component of a broader complex of policies that affect the outcomes that we're concerned about. There's policing, there's punishment, but there's also housing, there's employment, there's education, there's health, including mental health provision and so forth and so on. And so to the extent that these different systems of social activity interact with one another and affect the bottom line, that's something that would have to be taken into account. I mean, Coates is not entirely wrong to say that incarceration is not the only response that one can make to proliferation of social disorder. And one does then have to ask another question: why are our instincts more for the punitive than for other mechanisms of amelioration of the social disorder that we're rightly concerned about?
So I'd like to offer, I agree with you that what I think we could call sort of the conventional answer to the question is wanting, and that conventional answer would be, let's say, the answer given in the new Jim Crow, which is that mass incarceration is a form of racialized social control that was re-implemented in the aftermath of the breakdown of an old form of racialized social control, the old Jim Crow, and challenged by Great Migration, Civil Rights Movement. It was, America has this need for a racialized system of racialized social control and mass incarceration. I think that narrative is wrong for many of the reasons that you said, which is that there was a rise in crime and a rise in violence, and then there was a rise in punitiveness, not just amongst white Americans, but also amongst African Americans, and that's noted very well in James Forman's book. But there's a point that James Forman makes that I think I'd like to push you on a little bit, which is the argument that alongside this rise in punitive sentiment, there was also a rise in demands for these alternative ways of tackling the rise in violence, which would be a social policy response, not a punitive response, but a social policy response. Yet all America could deliver to its African Americans who were panicked about crime was punitiveness. And so I think to answer this question fully, we need to be able to answer that question, which is why was it that only punitiveness was on the table? My answer to this question is not exactly the Ta-Nehisi answer, in that it's not exactly that it's racism per se, but it's that America has a libertarian streak in its social policy, and the truth is that police and prisons are very, very inexpensive ways of handling social disorder. We spend a remarkably small proportion of our government revenues on punitive outlets. That's not always noted, but we actually spend more on social programs for the poor than on police and prisons. And it's always been a cheap way to handle social disorder. And the rise in violence came at exactly the wrong time in some ways in U.S. history. It came in the 70s at the time of economic crisis and shift to the right in American politics. So what's wrong with my answer to the puzzle? I mean, you said that there isn't just one answer, but I like my one answer. And I was wondering what's wrong with it?
Well, let me say one thing first. So one can understand the appeal of this narrative that America has had the problem, given that we began as a slave republic, and, chattel slavery, of controlling a population of color, controlling its African descended population. Loic Vacantes, this radical sociologist and a friend of mine who flew overnight from Paris to San Francisco so that he could appear unshaven at my Tanner lecture in 2007 and comment critically upon what I had to say. Anyway, Loic says there are these various epochs. You had slavery, then you had Jim Crow, and now you got mass incarceration. It's all about the same thing. The ghetto is a social structure aimed at exploiting the labor of the people who live there without having to socially integrate with them. The filmmaker Ava DuVernay understands the 13th Amendment to have been, in effect, a coded compact with the devil, because, after all, it abolishes involuntary servitude, except in the instances where someone will have been duly convicted of having violated the law. Well, that's a big exception, right? That was a hole you could drive a truck through, and the reason it's there is because they never intended to abolish slavery in the first place. They just wanted to carry it on by another name. I mean, that's all very, very seductive stuff. I'm not saying there's something wrong with your account, as I understand it. You say punishment is cheap, universal basic income is expensive. Punishment is cheap, universal health care, including mental health care, is damned expensive.
Very expensive.
So kind of let's deal with this problem in that way. Where I would object is the implicit assumption, the causal assumption, that the problem, disorder, high murder rates in Baltimore, St. Louis, Chicago, etc., is going to be moved. There's a lot of indirect linkages there, and how long and when and how much, by adopting a European-style welfare state. The implicit claim is we'd have much less violence in Chicago if we had a European-style welfare state. I don't know that that's true. I don't know what the evidence for that is. That's not an argument against the European-style welfare state, against a more generous social provision, but the claim that people concerned about violence in their streets will be satisfied with the outcome associated with a transformation of American social policy is a stretch to me. I think it requires further justification. In economics, we talk about, macroeconomic policy having a long and variable lag. How much, you inject money in, but when are you going to get an impact on employment? Well, you don't know. It might be 8 months. It might be 18 months. I think the lag and the variability of the lag between broad-based social policy moves on the one hand and disorder on the streets of a city on the other is longer and even more variable.
So I want to put a pin in just that last part, because I think we'll come back to this policy discussion, because I want to ask you then, if not a European-style welfare state, what is it that we should do about high murder rates in Chicago? But I think we should save that for the end, because one thing that we should do before we tackle that is we should offer an explanation for the second analytical question,
Can I just say something before you go on?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, because, again, I'm an economist. You think about incentives all the time and stuff like that. So there's universal and there's targeted. Okay, so Suppose universal is vastly expensive, right? We're going to endow a 300 million society with, $10,000 a year benefits. That comes out to the number that you can figure out. Targeted, on the other hand, responds to events by dealing with the individuals who are implicated. Okay, so a criminal offender, all right, so we can have punishment. You say that's cheap, or we can have mental health and education and whatnot, which is more expensive for the offender.
But punishment is cheap precisely because it's targeted, right? That's partly my point.
To the extent that responses to offending are focused on rehabilitation and enhancing opportunities for the person who was offended so that they needn't behave in this way going forward, that too is targeted. That's a targeted benefit. The benefit is targeted on the person who was offended.
Sure.
I need mental health. I have to break the law in order to get it. I need employment training. I'm only going to get the program when I'm inside prison because we've decided that we're going to target our benefits on people who have offended. Somehow that's not quite right either. Not right on an incentive point of view. We don't want to have people thinking that the only way they're going to get the attention of the government is that they find themselves in trouble, but also not right at a normative level, in that the people who have to pay the bill, I'm talking about the taxpayers, who are offended by the offense, are now placed in the position of providing benefits to people who have broken the societal norms. What makes them deserving? Does deservingness enter into our thinking at all when we talk about issues of crime and punishment? Do people disqualify themselves from a sympathetic response from the state? To the extent that they elect to offend against the norms that allow us all to live together in peace and security.
Can I answer that later, or do you want me to answer that now?
No, you can.
Because I know that we disagree about this, because we talked about this recently.
Let's do it later.
Let's do it later. Is that okay?
Okay, yeah, we're moving on to number 2.
Yes, let's tackle number 2 first. So, the question in number 2 is very straightforward, right? There is a very large white-black disparity in incarceration rates. And the conventional answer, maybe I should put conventional in scare quotes, but the conventional answer is that is explained by explicit and implicit bias at various places in the criminal justice system, from police to prosecutors to juries to judges. All of that explicit and implicit bias adds up to explain this disparity. I think you think that conventional answer is wrong, and I think that conventional answer is also wrong. But in its place, we need an answer. So what explains the white-black differential in incarceration?
Okay, well, differential rates of offending is the first order thing that one wants to look at. I don't doubt, and Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow, chronicles this, and there are studies out there, sort of micro-targeted focus studies of policing in Seattle or whatever. I don't doubt that there is bias in policing, that there is greater attention to certain kinds of law breaking in certain communities than others. I'm not aware of many dorm rooms being raided on college campuses to find drugs under the mattress, but I'm pretty sure the drugs are there under the mattress.
You're scandalizing the parents.
I'm sorry. My son is a graduate of Columbia University, and I would visit him there often on campus. He belonged to a fraternity, and I got kind of an insider's account of what was going on. And then when there was this big bus, I don't know if anybody remembers this, like 5, 6, 7 years ago, there was a big bus. It converged on one of the frat houses, and they find that these guys were, and they were dealing with some pretty heavy hitters in the local drug market around there, some violent people. It was a really serious matter. And my son says, "You're surprised, Dad? You're surprised? Come on, I could have told you that was going on." But, that's the exception, not the rule that we read about that. Whereas if I'm doing, drug trafficking on the streets of Baltimore, Chicago, or St. Louis, I can expect that I'm going to attract the attention of the cops, that some undercover somebody is going to show up and try to buy from me, and I'm going to end up getting busted. So I don't doubt that kind of stuff is going on. But I think the first order account isn't bias. I think it's differences in rates of offending, especially violent offending. Now, we can step back a minute and ask, where do those differences come from? And when we do, I think we're going to end up in your territory. We're going to end up talking about communities, opportunity, concentrated poverty, failed education, no employment options, peer influences, so forth, gang activity and all of that. And that's going to have a racial coloration, not because race has anything causally to do with any of those things, but because the society itself has organized its networks of social connection in part around race, because urban communities are segregated by race and so on, because if there are negative peer influences that are transmitted through informal associations, those are going to run to some degree along racial lines. What am I saying in sum? I'm saying the straight, again, this is going to be Loury's mantra here, the straightforward racism, America's a racist society and bias is the explanation of racial disparity, is, I think, overly simplistic. Not that it's necessarily wrong, because of course there is bias, but it is inadequate to the explanatory problem of accounting for the differences across races in incarceration rates. And I think an unwillingness to acknowledge the disparity in offending is problematic politically, because people can see it. And, sociologists can tell us that it's not there until they turn blue in the face, but that's not going to keep people from opening up the newspaper and noticing the impressions that they get about differences, and the statistics bear that out. So it's problematic politically, but I think it's also problematic at a normative level, because the offending creates victims. And the victims of violent offending by African Americans, which is significantly higher than other ethnic groups in the society, are themselves disproportionately African American. And the first business of the state is to secure us and our property and in our person. And a disattention to the racial disparities and offending rates, which I believe are at the root of the racial disparity in incarceration rates, is in effect a disattention to one of the things that makes for significant social inequality across racial lines in the society, since most of the people living in low-income and concentrated poverty and minority neighborhoods are not offenders, but are disproportionately likely to be the victims of offense.
So I think I agree with most of that, because you gave what I understand to be the sociological or liberal account of those racial disparities, which is that they are rooted in racial inequality and concentrated exposure to concentrated disadvantage, things like this. If that's true, then isn't it right to also consider offenders victims? Why are offenders not victims? Why are only those who are victims of crimes victims? They're not victims of crimes, but they're victims of the way in which we've organized our society, are they not? I asked that because I feel like you didn't give us the full Glenn Loury experience, because there's another...
Well, they're victims and they're victims. I mean, okay, this is very philosophical, right?
As it should be.
I mean, what does it mean for someone to be victimized, right? And am I playing with words when I say we didn't vote in a Full Employment Act of 2018, therefore we victimized all of the people who don't have jobs? I don't think that's, I mean, that may be bad social policy, that may be, maybe people in a just society would have had a different social, dispensation. But I don't equate that with putting a pistol against someone's head and taking their wallet. I don't equate that with shooting somebody. With breaking into their house and stealing their stuff. So what are people entitled to? Are they entitled to a European-style welfare state? So anyway, maybe I'm just quibbling about words. I don't want to say that they were victimized by it.
Well, I don't think we need to get hung up on the word victim.
Okay.
The issue, obviously, is do we hold these people morally responsible in some important substantive sense, or
Okay.
Or is it the case that these are really all more or less very easy to explain. After all, our prisons are not full of Bernie Madoffs. Our prisons are full of people who live childhoods of violence. Disproportionate number of them are mentally ill. Almost all of them are very, very poor. We're always very, very poor. I mean,
And this is regrettable, and I'm not just saying that. This is regrettable. And as a, read my book, Race, Incarceration, and American Values. Not you, because I know you have, but I'm saying to people out there, because I'm getting ready to say something.
you're getting ready to say something that is regrettable? I don't know if you should do that.
No, I'm getting ready to say something that might be controversial, which is that poverty doesn't exempt somebody from moral judgment when they do something wrong. That's what I'm getting ready to say. It may even account for the fact that they did something wrong, but it doesn't exempt them from moral judgment for that, at least not in my philosophical universe. There are many, many reasons why people do things. Okay, a perpetrator of domestic violence no doubt has a story. That person who perpetrated domestic violence, beat up the spouse, has a story. There was a reason for that. Okay? You could probably give a psychological account for 90% of the people who do something like that, in which we would come out feeling, well, did they really have control? Did they really have a choice? We're not about to debate whether or not we're going to hold such a person responsible for abuse within the household based on some speculation about their psychological history. We're going to judge them to have broken a norm that we regard as essential to the maintenance of order within our society. So I can agree with you, the sociologist, about the fact that broader social conditions of opportunity, to the extent that they have not been provided at some macro level, are responsible for trends in criminal offending and so forth. I can agree with that and disagree with the claim that a person is a victim, that is to say, not to be held morally responsible, that is to be said, gets a get out of jail free card because they grew up poor. What are we saying to the person who lies bleeding out in the street and their family when we take the youngster whose pistol in his hand and he pulled the trigger and he perpetrated this act, and there goes a life bleeding out on the street? What are we going to say to that person or their family when we take the offender and we say of the offender, well, of course he's not morally responsible. Did you see the housing project that he grew up in? That's, to my mind, that is a kind of pulling on the thread of what a civilized society needs in order to hold together. It's a kind of soft corruption. I'm sorry, it's a strong word, but it's a kind of abandonment of our responsibilities because we owe that victim something.
So you've taken us unavoidably towards the normative, the philosophical. And so I think we should, I don't know exactly how much.
A few minutes, and then we'll open up to questions.
Oh, we're already at
Yeah,
a few
maybe
minutes.
another
Okay.
5.
Okay, so let's switch.
I have a feeling there are a few questions or comments.
We're going to skip question 3, which was this cross-national question, and we can save it for the Q&A if anyone's interested. But I'd like to push you on this point, because I think you've articulated a philosophy of punishment. In other words, you've articulated reasons that a society should punish, which I fundamentally disagree with. I mean, your argument is that societies should punish in order to hold offenders accountable, in order to express condemnation for what they have done. To my mind, if you live in a society in which most of the offenders are poor, racially marginalized, many of them mentally ill, many of them addicted to various substances, if all of that is true, that philosophy of punishment doesn't really hold water. And instead, the only real justification for a criminal justice system is as a public health response to crime, which recognizes our obligations to victims to keep victims safe, but treats crime the way that we would treat disease. And so an enormous amount of our resources should go towards the prevention of crime. Confinement is justified, just as we would confine someone who might have Ebola or something like that. But I don't see any grounds for what you're articulating, which I recognize as a retributive justification for punishment, which is that we're holding people responsible. Because I just don't think if you can give a full causal account of why most individuals in our prisons committed crime, that you can hold them responsible in that way. I mean, in effect, Glenn, you wouldn't hold somebody who committed a crime with a gun held to their head morally responsible for that crime. It doesn't make sense. It's absurd. And I think that, in effect, society has held a gun to the head of most of the people who ended up in its prisons.
And
What's wrong with that?
I think that underestimates people massively.
You don't disagree with my causal account. You just disagree with the moral implications of it. Because you've said yourself that you believe that you could give a full account of maybe 90% of the people who are inside American prisons, of why they've ended up there. Is that right?
Here's what I disagree with. I disagree with the claim that, with the implicit claim that environmental circumstances are determinative of people's behaviors. Influencing one thing is one thing. Giving me a lever to try to get some statistical purchase on trends or cross-sectional or whatever is one thing. But an individual human being, I don't see how I'm dealing with a human being unless I endow that person with the capacity to make choices about how it is that they live their lives. Are those choices influenced by things? Of course they are. Nobody is in a vacuum outside of society or outside of the physical environment. We're going to find lead in the paint. We're going to ask about nutrition. We're going to ask about prenatal care and things like that. All of those things are going to be determinative of the development, of neurological development, the emotional status of a human being who then may or may not be able to handle stress very well, may not have anger impulse control development, so forth and so on. Those things are real. The child rearing and patterns and practices of upbringing within the household that socialize children in one way or another, make them more or less amenable to this or that kind of deleterious influence. Those things are real. But what is the world that I live in when I say about a person who perpetrates a heinous crime, they didn't have any choice. They were victims. So we're back to the word victim. I don't want to get on the word victim, but I want to get on the idea of choice. Really? They don't have any choice? That reduces them to chits. They're now just baubles at the end of a string. They're now just the subjects of historical forces. Where is free will? No, I'm not being naive. I'm saying you don't have to pick up the gun and walk outside. And moreover, what about communal responses to patterns of behavior within communities that are disruptive, that are destructive, that hurt other people, that undermine the quality of life? There really is no lever anywhere to pull except the state. There really are no devices, no means, no responses, no initiatives that can be deployed to more effectively socialize young people within the community so that, and they're in their maturity, they're not antisocial and whatnot, other than food stamps? Where is the community? Where are the families? Where are the human beings? There's nothing left but automata who are responding to external forces. So in the same way that a consciousness within, let's say, an African-American community over some period of time about identity and worthiness of people who are of color can be transformed, right? If I look at African-American society from, I don't know, the 1950s onward, I look at the rise of Afro-cultural orientation, I look at black pride, power, people wearing their hair naturally, people becoming interested in Africa, people saying, no, I don't have to bleach my skin, I don't have, whatever. Those dynamics of affirmation of the dignity of blackness were not a government program. That didn't depend upon what the state did. That depended upon how African American people organized themselves within our own social and spiritual lives to construct and enforce and promulgate a different way of thinking about ourselves within the society. So I just give that as an example of agency. So that's the word that I'm looking for. I'm looking for the word agency. There's no agency in your universe.
Well, but in your account of what we might call cultural pathologies, you've alluded to concentrated poverty and the absence of resources in these communities to fund those institutions that would mount that kind of cultural response. That was your own account, and I like that account. What's wrong with that as an account of the absence of this affirmative cultural response? Because ultimately it takes resources to build churches and build social organizations, community associations. And in the absence of those resources, I don't see how you can fault those communities for mounting that response.
Okay.
But we might go back.
Yeah.
Can I ask you
Maybe one last
one
question,
last question?
and then we'll
Yeah.
open it.
Okay, one last question. So the last question, I think our discussion might have been slightly disorienting in that, in a good way, in that it's not clear if you accept the corrective that we've offered to the conventional narrative that you've offered, that actually many of the people who are inside American prisons are not just guilty of smoking weed on the corner or something, but have actually done some awful things to people for a whole host of reasons, but they've done these awful things. It invites the question, what's wrong with American mass incarceration? And I know that you have been a public voice for reform, and so could you outline your answer to that question? What is the issue, normative issue, with American mass incarceration? And maybe, since we just have one question, I'm going to put two questions together. If you had the reins of government, what is it that you would do? If it's not mount a European-style welfare state response, what is it that government should do about that problem?
Yeah, I'm not against mounting a European-style welfare state response. I'm just saying the failure to do so is not in itself a cause of crime, or it shouldn't be understood as, undermining the impulse in society to isolate and stigmatize people who offend against our norms. Our sentences are way too long. We don't need to have sentences as long as, that would be one thing that would come out of a cross-national comparison if we were to look at the differences in systems across the thing. I think the decriminalization of drug use and possession, at least below a certain level, would be a big step forward. I think the abandonment of the goal of having some kind of rehabilitative or human enhancement dimension to the punishment activity, which Garland describes in his books, the change in penology and the philosophy of what's supposed to happen inside of prisons. I don't know that our prisons need to be anywhere near as warehousing and inhumane. Might be more expensive, but you look at TV documentaries where the journalists travel to Germany or Sweden and they see how they do it there, and prisons don't look at all the same as they look here in the United States. I imagine that there's some sort of technical gimmickry that one could work. Let's let the people who are making decisions that lead to incarceration bear the cost of those decisions. So that if local actors are imposing costs on state prison systems through the judgments that they're making about how to handle law enforcement, let's try to find incentive devices so that some of the cost implicit on sending somebody upstate hit the county or the city's budget as opposed to simply the state's budget. Most of these cases are pleaded out, so one could look at the way in which prosecutors and courts are actually dealing with these cases when they come up, and try to shift power in the direction of defendants in these court proceedings and so on. But I don't have answers to this problem up here. I'm not going to claim that I do.
All right, great. I'll just say, my understanding of Enlightenment involves disruption and disorienting. I mean, Enlightenment's about forcing people to recognize that the conventional answers that they usually got from somebody else probably aren't adequate, and they need to use their own powers of reason and evaluate different arguments. And to me, that's the essence of what you did and the essence of what you do for all the rest of us in this community. It's fabulous, fabulously disorienting. Let's open it up to questions. Thank you both. Yes.
Thank you very much. You really opened my eyes. And I have watched some of this 60 Minutes, but I'm not totally out of the loop. But my question is, what's the European system, the welfare state, because they don't have as many people in prison, from what you're saying. What is that system?
Should we collect a few, or should we?
Yeah, let's collect a few and then yes?
Professor I welcome his views about the concept of restorative justice. And I live in Seattle, where there's a lot of support for that idea.
Maybe we'll take one more in this round. I saw hand.
What effect do the activities, lobbying or otherwise, of private prison institutions have on this issue? Is this something we should be concerned about?
Gentlemen.
How should we do it? Shall I go first? Or?
Yeah, you go first.
Okay, all right. So I won't answer everything, but I'll answer a little bit, and then you can mop
Okay,
up.
I'll see what.
So in response to this question, I think what I would pinpoint in the European response to violence and crime that differs from the United States is two things. One is the social policy response, so the response of government in its welfare programs and its housing programs, healthcare programs, to the problem of social disorder. And that we know by cross-national measures, the United States spends less on its poor than European countries do. So that would be the first thing. The other thing is what Glenn was alluding to in the end of his comments, which is the way that prisons are run and justified philosophically, which is that the purpose is not punitive or stigmatizing. The purpose is rehabilitative and to train people to reintegrate into society. And that's something that's absent in American prisons. The kind of work opportunities that are available in American prisons are basically work opportunities to keep prisons clean and running. They subsidize labor at the prison. They're not about reintegration into society. So that is what I would pinpoint in the European model. I'll skip the restorative justice question and you can tackle it. The private prisons point, I would just say that I think that this story gets a lot more analytical play than it actually has. Very few, I think, I wish I could remember exactly the numbers, but I think it's on the region of 7 to 8% of American prisoners are held in private facilities. So the lion's share of the problem is in the public system. A very good book on this subject is a recent book by a man named John Pfaff called Locked In. And he takes this up as one of his myths of what explains American mass incarceration. So I don't think it's a strong explanation.
Yeah, I agree with that about private prisons. And I think it invites a deeper reflection about when you would object to and worry about the privatization of public activities more broadly. I mean, and once you get beyond the labor interest, well, privatized doesn't have to go past the public employee union or something like that. It's an end run around the public employee union. You start asking, what is it about a service or a product, the public manufacture of which is essential to the value of the product, to the delivery of the product? I'm against capital punishment for principal reasons. But if there were going to be capital punishment, I'd be doubly against the idea of delegating that activity to a private provider. And that would have not so much to do with the fact that someone has a profit interest in the service, but in the fact that the meaning of the activity that's being undertaken, which is the public extirpation of human life on behalf of something, requires the state's involvement in the carrying out of that activity. And I can imagine an argument along those lines. I can imagine an argument along the lines of kind of economic theory of contracts or something like that that says that if I can't stipulate every dimension of a service provision, like the attitude that guards will employ in dealing with obstreperous inmates, the extent to which they will expose themselves to risk in order to avoid having to use force to control somebody, something like that. That's a dimension of the product, the service here being incarceration services, and some aspect of that product is not visible to the government as it's purchasing this service, and it's not contractable. It's not easy to specify exactly the circumstances under which I would want this behavior and not that behavior to be undertaken by a prison guard. And I do an arm's length and I contract that out to somebody else who has an interest in the bottom line, which means that they're going to try to economize wherever they can. So they're not going to attend as much to this dimension of the service as I would have wanted them to, and I can't force them to in the contract because it's not contractable. It's not something that can be observed and verified and told you're in violation of. Then I might want to do it myself to make sure that I have direct control over the delivery of the service, because then I can guard against the moral hazard of somebody So anyway, there are arguments like that about privatization. I think the trope or the narrative about private prisons and so on and mass incarceration, a product of private prisons, is more of an expression of ideology than it is a claim about evidence, for the reason that you say the numbers are actually small. But the idea of private profiteers in the business of incarceration, and that this feeds this story about capitalism being at the root of the problem. And I think there are plenty of problems with capitalism, but I don't think that that this is one of them. I don't know what to say about restorative justice in Seattle. Maybe you can tell me something about what you're talking about explicitly in that regard, because.
Well, I'm more interested in the philosophy of it. Actually, there's a lot of it, and I don't know evidence about what difference it makes, if any, which is what I was hoping maybe
Yeah.
you did and had some views about. But there's been a lot of opposition to the building of a new juvenile detention facility that is part of a larger court building that was passed by an initiative a few years ago, and now it's being built, and there are a lot of people that are demonstrating and generally opposing the use of millions of dollars for
I
that
see.
purpose. And they're doing this in the name of restorative justice. The number of juveniles, the absolute number of juveniles actually locked up in that facility has shrunken over the years. And they're saying, we don't really need all these beds anyway.
I see.
But my real interest is, your philosophy, what you know about the evidence or lack thereof.
Yeah, I don't think I have a lot to contribute on that. I do want to add one thing, though, in the context of discussing reform, because the implications of incarceration extend beyond the actual time that a person is in prison. The collateral sanctions, the disqualification from various benefits, the reputational damage, the hit on their employment prospects, and so on. Even some people being taken off of the voting rolls and consequence of their having felony convictions and whatnot. And that's not something that we have to do. And everything from ban the box advocacy to try to prevent information about history of incarceration from following a person in their employment prospects, to restoring people to voting rights, or even allowing people to vote while they're incarcerated. Why is excommunication from the civic body the necessary concomitant of incarcerating somebody? I don't see the need for that. Why is disqualifying people from Pell Grant benefits for educational expenditures that they might want to undertake to enhance their effectiveness as members of society a sort of collateral sanction that follows the fact of their incarceration? So,
Take a couple more questions. Yes?
So I think this was a great conversation, by the way. Thank you so much. I think, sort of unpacking whether criminals are victims is really deserves a long discussion. But I really want to point to the facts where you talked about, murdering somebody doesn't necessarily absolve them from moral judgment, and I'll give you that point. But conditional on committing the crime, right? Why are the punitive responses to these kinds of crimes so different based on the race of the perpetrator? I think that's the core of the mass incarceration problem and the disparities we see with race. And I don't think your conversation necessarily got at that point. Can you talk about that?
Yes.
Yeah, with a significant percentage of our young male population in prison, the effect that has on our economy and our workforce. We have a shrinking labor force in this country due to the graying of my generation. And my kids are not spawning at the same rate as their parents were. And now we've taken this whole block of young people who can be added to the economy and leave them in prison. I mean, is there an economic way of dealing with this and solving the problem and also helping the economy in general?
well, on that, I'd say the fact that you've got someone north of 2 million people at a given point in time under lock and key, and you got a labor force of 150 million or something like that. It's a non-trivial number, and if you could wave a wand and you could take everybody who happened to be incarcerated and put them behind a desk or on a computer or on an assembly line or something, making a productive contribution, that would obviously be a better outcome from the point of view of economic productivity. But you have to allow that the fact that the person is in prison might actually be relevant to the judgment about how much they might have contributed in some other context. You can't just take a magic wand. The development problem, the problem of the loss of effective manpower, woman power, to the economy is a problem that predates the incarceration of the person. You want to ask about their education and about their socialization. That they are unavailable to work because they are behind bars might only be one of the reasons why they are unavailable to make a productive contribution to the economy.
Yeah, differential rates of differential punishment.
So there's one other thing that I just wanted to say in response to that question, and then I'll tackle this question. So your question got me thinking about the way in which reform is often motivated in American society today, which is that we spend too much money on our prisons and on our prisoners in particular. You often hear this figure that we spend $30,000 to $40,000 a year imprisoning a person. Why don't we just spend $30,000 to $40,000 educating a person? And I think there's something jarring about that statistic, as there should be. But I also do believe, and I think Glenn said this in the end of his remarks, that in a good society, we would probably spend more than $30,000 to $40,000 on any given prisoner, precisely because those people come from some of the most disadvantaged backgrounds. They should receive a lion's share of society's attention and funds. You know, a good society that built these social democratic cottages that you alluded to, where prisoners are given opportunities for leisure and education, might spend a lot more than $30,000 to $40,000 on that prisoner, and that's a good thing from the perspective of social justice, in my view. In response to your question, which is I think a very good question, one thing that I would say is to reissue something that Glenn said earlier, which is that there is certainly various forms of explicit and implicit bias along the chain of the criminal justice system, and that is egregious and a scandal and should be rooted out, there's no question. The best estimates that I've seen of the amount that racism in the criminal justice system contributes to sentencing disparities is about 20%. So this is based on federal data from the federal system. So African Americans and white Americans who commit comparable crimes and have same sort of criminal histories, African Americans are sentenced to sentences of about 20% longer than white Americans. And that's absolutely scandalous, and it should be rooted out. It is important, though, to remember that the total disparity, white-black disparity, is about 500%. So African Americans are about 5 times more likely to be in prison than white Americans. So while implicit, explicit bias is a very important, salient social fact, it explains, I would disagree with your statement that it is the mass incarceration problem for the reasons that Glenn was saying, which is that
It is at the core, right?
I mean, maybe that's quibbling about words. It's an important part of it, I agree, but it's also true to say that it explains only about 4% of the total white-black disparity, specifically sentencing disparities. And the best estimate in general is about 70 to 80% is explained by disparate rates of offending and 20% by some form of bias.
Right, so just have a minor
Sure.
point to add there. So you're sort of doing comparison at internal margins where you're looking at sentencing lengths. But what about the fact that whites who do commit crimes are often not given incarceration sentences?
Yeah,
They're
exactly.
probably put on probation or community
Yeah,
service.
totally.
So that's something that's not even equated.
Yeah,
out.
there's bias. In other words, I think to make your point, there's bias in policing, bias in prosecuting, bias in sentencing, and bias in parole, too. But the way that scholars of criminal justice try and assess how much that matters is by comparing our best estimates of rates of offending as an input to rates of incarceration as an output. And we get estimates of rates of offending from victim surveys. And so the best estimate that I've seen, which is from a paper published just this year in the Journal of Quantitative Criminology, is that about 70 to 80% of the final disparity can be explained by rates of offending, which means that about 20 to 30% of the problem is bias of some kind, a very serious kind that needs to be rooted out. But it also reissues the point that you made earlier, which is that rates of offending are also a serious source of the bias at the end. But we should talk about it later, sure.
Last word, Glenn?
I'm good.
I see there are a number of hands. I'm going to ask you to continue the conversation outside. We have a reception and breakfast, which you're all invited to attend. But before you do that, I want to take this opportunity to thank Adaner and Glenn for modeling today liberal arts education at its best. But even more important than that, on a daily basis, doing it for this community. It's an extraordinary privilege for me personally to be your colleagues and to be on the receiving end of this kind of conversation so frequently. Thank you all. Thank you.